Thank you so much. I love that I get to go after Casey because he looked 10 years back and now I get to help you guys think about the next decade. So I work for an organization called the Institute for the Future, which is a 46-year-old nonprofit research group based in Palo Alto. And we help people and organizations think systematically about the future to help them make better decisions in the present. Over the last year or so, we did a research project on the future of philanthropy. And it really started because we were looking at all of the interesting people that we get to work with every day who are sort of out on the fringe, doing things very differently, people that we see as entrepreneurs and signals of the future. And we wanted to capture what they were doing. And we were asked to do so by a foundation, the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation. And so I want to share with you some of the results of this research and some of what's to come in the future. So when we talk about the future, I always like to start with this William Gibson quote. He's a well-known sci-fi author, and he says, "The future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed." And that's a lot of what my job is. I look for the places where the future's already here. I look for discoveries and signals, usage patterns, organizations, people who are doing things really differently. And I try to collect all of them together and figure out what it means, what they're doing differently, and what we could learn for the future. So these are 5 future forces that we ended up discovering were really enabling a lot of the social entrepreneurs that we saw making the most impact in the world. So I want to take you through some of the stories of the people that we've been tracking. So the first is crowd power. Most of you have probably used or heard of or been a part of a Kickstarter campaign or an Indiegogo campaign or some kind of crowdfunding effort. But crowd power really goes beyond funding and sourcing. It's really thinking about using a crowd and their power in lots of different ways. So using people's brain power, using their time, using surplus resources, and in many new ways creating value. So this is one of my favorite examples. Rolling Jubilee is a group that started out of the Occupy movement. And what they started to do was raise funds through the crowd and use those funds to buy debt on the secondary market and then forgive debt anonymously. So it's like a bailout for the people by the people. And I love them. I love their work. And they were saying, 1 in 7 Americans is pursued by a debt collector. And that's astonishing. It's very scary. How are we going to have any kind of social impact if we can't solve our own financial situation? So it's one of the examples I really love. The last time I checked, they raised $700,000 about, and they forgave $15 million worth of debt. So a pretty powerful thing. Also that it's anonymous. You have no idea whether your debt is going to be forgiven or not. So another group that's been doing a lot of work in a different element of crowd power is a group started by my friend Jerry Paffendorf. He has done a lot of different projects in Detroit. So he had started a company called Loveland Technologies a while back that was mapping a lot of the foreclosures and sales of homes and residences all across Detroit. And he really wanted to know, who's owning our city now and what's happening to it. And this is one of his later projects. He started mapping Blight across Detroit. And the purpose of it was to say, well, if we know where there's blight, then we can actually direct investment in those spaces and help revitalize our community. So he got all kinds of people to bring their iPads and their cell phones and all sorts of things to take pictures of blight and text them to a depository that he had. And through that, he ended up mapping a lot of the blight of Detroit. So those are two instances of different kinds of crowd power than just funding. A second force that we've been paying a lot of attention to is what we call algorithmic coordination. It's kind of a big word, but it means really beyond big data. So what are we capable of in interpreting data in new ways? So what we mean by that is being able to bring the maximum impact by coordinating the right resources at the right time with the right people. And there's lots of different groups that are doing this in interesting ways. One of my favorites is a group called Matternet. They've developed drone technology and are using it in infrastructure weak countries. One of the pilots they have is in Haiti. And their whole point is, how do we use really new technology in the most extreme circumstances to help get the right things to the right people at the right time? So they're delivering medical goods, food, all kinds of materials, and they're capable of doing this and rerouting if all of a sudden, there's a new need elsewhere. And it's a pretty amazing thing. Instead of having to build roads or large infrastructure projects, they're very nimble in what they're doing. Another group is called Near Me. This is basically like an Airbnb platform for anything. You can sign up and create desks near me, which actually exists. Or there's another one I love, which is like RV parking near me. So you can figure out, if you're going on a road trip with your RV, that you can rent somebody's backyard as your parking space where you are going. But it's a really interesting way of thinking about the marketplace of commons, that any kind of latent resource like your desks or your lawn could actually be used by lots of other people in a really interesting way. Another kind of algorithmic coordination is a project in the UK called Good Gym. And this was started by a group of runners. And they wanted to do good while they were on their runs. And so they decided, we're already traveling along. Why don't we match ourselves up with isolated senior citizens who are along our running routes? And so they match themselves up, and these are their coaches, which I love. And, we'll deliver the mail, we'll have a conversation, a cup of tea, any kind of meaningful experience together. And so it's another way of thinking about what resources do you have, what's the right moment to use them, and how can you coordinate between people. So everybody's been talking about Bitcoin and alternative currencies, but we kind of wanted to go a bit bigger than that and say there's this thing called multi-currency. Like what are some of the new types of ways that we can exchange value with each other that might not be dollars? Jana is one of my favorite examples. They started as a company in the mobile space, and they wanted to capture the $200 billion being spent on advertising in the developing world and actually give some of that money to people in the developing world who were consumers. And so they are kind of a advertising agency to some degree. So if you are advertising via SMS or text message, and as a consumer, if you click on the ad or you respond, you get paid, you get compensated in mobile airtime. So you get like phone credits. And phone credits are pretty much 10% of the income of a lot of salaries in the developing world. It's a huge amount of what they spend their money on is their mobile device. So Jana started saying, well, this is a way that we can give money back to consumers there. And why don't we start partnering with groups that can actually really use this group in new ways? So they partnered with the United Nations and ended up having a survey go out through Jana to all of their customers. And through doing this, they actually it was a survey about disaster preparedness. And the UN had planned to send 10 researchers out into different countries to figure out the level of disaster preparedness. And it's a very deep type of research. It's ethnographic, it takes a lot of time. And instead they were like, well, let's try out Jana. And so they used it, and they had over 400% increase in response. They got the data almost immediately. It was really quick. And it was cost saving too. So a new kind of currency. Yurtle's another one. We use this a lot in San Francisco, but it is a way to share lots of different goods that you happen to have around the house. So camping gear, you can give somebody your sleeping bag, your bike, or juicer, or whatever it is that you happen to have that you don't want anymore. And in return, you can take other things from that same community. So it's a more formal barter system. So I've talked about different ways that people are using sort of new currencies, and I've talked about ways that people are coordinating things. But we're also actually coordinating people in different ways. We're organizing differently. And we ended up calling this adhocracy. It's really the fact that people are trying to do really amazing things in the world without forming organizations. That they're trying to do things that allow them to jump in and out of roles and have a much less formal structure of participation. This is Mike Zuckerman. He's a good friend of mine and a culture hacker in San Francisco. And he and a group of friends started a project last year called, June 2013, called Free Space. And Free Space, they decided, was going to be a project where they rented a blighted building in the mid-market area of San Francisco for $1 for the month of June. And they said, well, what if we just open it with no purpose, no agenda, and see sort of what the community does with this space? And so they did that. They cleaned it up on the inside, and they had some really awesome graphic artists come and paint the outside. And then they opened it to the community, and they said, come with your projects and whatever you want to do here. And people came in droves. They showed up with donated gear and mics and had open nights for all kinds of projects. They had yoga classes. They had a bike lending library that started, a learning shelter that started, all kinds of different engagements and projects in the community. And the only rules of the space were that no money could be transacted. It was a free space. And that you couldn't be an observer. You had to be a participant in some way. And since then, they've actually opened free spaces in, I think, 26 places now. Everywhere from Uganda to Paris to Catalonia, Rio, the Philippines. And Mike called me tonight before this talk, and he's in Tokyo, opening free space in Tokyo. And each of them is different. None of them are really the same, and frankly, they have no leader and no coordination. They are not a formal organization of any kind. But that doesn't prevent them from doing really awesome stuff in lots of different parts of the world and using local culture to their benefit. So a really interesting kind of ad hoc system. Another example is one from Detroit, where a young man was very upset that the light rail system that was anticipated in Detroit was no longer going to happen because of the bankruptcy. And he said, this is really a shame. This is the one thing I was counting on in order to get to and from in Detroit. And so he decided to start his own bus company. And he figured out, what are the routes that people really need access to? And he started talking to the municipal organizations and figuring out what they needed. Where are the loopholes? Where are the gaps? And so he started this bus company with the sole intention of going out of business. He really doesn't want to be in the bus company world. He wants the government to do that to some degree. But he's helping out in the meantime, and it's a pretty ad hoc system, which is really cool. So the final force that I want to tell you about that we think is affecting a lot of different entrepreneurial activities in the future is radical transparency. And by this, we really mean the shrinking of the relationship between a donor and a beneficiary. That in many ways, because we have so much access to information, to new technologies, we're actually able to have a different kind of relationship. And so these are some of the groups that are doing this in different ways. Sometimes it's about knowing a lot about a brand and what materials they use, the processes they use, where everything comes from. GuideStar is a great example of a way to know more about a nonprofit, how they're organized, how their finances are used, how their overhead is spent. To projects like Give Directly, which has been kind of controversial this year. They give direct cash transfers to households that are under a certain poverty level in Africa with no conditions. They just give cash. And by doing so, they've really angered certain NGOs that spend a lot of time on overhead and conditions and other types of requirements. So definitely a radical version of transparency. So these are the 5 forces I want to leave you with, and my hope is that you will actually take these into the projects that you do in the future, that you will think about how you do good and what kind of philanthropy you do and what it could look like if you were engaging in one of these in terms of how you give forward. So we actually developed a map, and this is part of what's on the map, but it's online for free if anybody wants to see it, and otherwise I'd love to talk to people later. Thanks so much.